I was a big believer in Dr. Anthony Fauci, and now I'm beginning to wonder. So I don't think it means that everything he said was wrong at all, but we now know that he did lie on some very important matters, and that he apparently had a giant ego and was obsessed with how he was perceived in the media. The release of his diaries have proved a little bit devastating. We've got the receipts for you now with Anna.
Let me just begin this by saying that the one thing that I think the conservative Americans were correct about, especially as it pertained to the pandemic, was questioning authority and questioning our institutions. When the pandemic began, I had too much trust in our institutions. I have now switched over to having zero trust in our institutions. And when you have zero trust in our institutions, you're more likely to land at the accurate information, okay? This information that we now have, thanks to details of Fauci's diary being released, is beyond infuriating. And in fact, I think he should be prosecuted for it.
Okay, I don't know that I'd go that far, but I will tell you this. So we're gonna give you the details, but as you go through this, keep in mind, and there's one important detail I really wanna highlight here, the difference between scientists and the government. Fauci here was acting more in the role of the government rather than the scientists. In fact, he buried scientific findings. What it actually makes me the angriest about what Fauci did is how he accidentally, I guess, smeared scientists.
Prosecuted, Cenk, prosecuted. Let me just explain something. When we talk about gain of function research, when scientists in these biolabs that are sprinkled across the globe that we fund, what do you think we are funding that research for? Do you think we're funding gain of function research because we want to make sure we keep the global population safe from viruses? No, they're developing biological weapons. That's what they're doing. That's what that is. We are funding that. And there was a lab leak that Anthony Fauci knew about and he buried it.
Yeah.
Okay, prosecuted.
Yeah, look, I don't know that it's just for biological weapons. I think the scientists involved, I'm sure some of them earnestly believe, hey, we've got to develop some sort of defenses for these viruses when they come. But gain of function research is very dangerous and very questionable. So let's give you the facts on what happened, and then we'll discuss more.
So this is all due to Senator Rand Paul publishing 1,100 pages from Dr. Fauci's diary, which, let's just pause, diary. Okay, you're a grown man. Okay, you got a diary where you incriminated yourself, but fantastic. So,
just real quick on that, if you're wondering why do we even care about his diary? Why are we concerned? He was keeping notes so that he could publish a book and et cetera, et cetera.
Good job.
Yeah,
good job.
And that's more self-aggrandizement, wealth, et cetera.
Yes. So anyway, 1,100 pages of his diary were released by Senator Rand Paul. Fauci is going to testify before Congress tomorrow, and so Rand Paul puts this out ahead of that testimony. Fauci was the former director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, and the pages basically cover his thoughts and what was happening internally from December of 2019, so at the very beginning of the virus, COVID-19 pandemic, through his retirement 3 years later in December of 2022. Now, one of the most damning revelations, if you ask me, had to do with the origins of the virus. The prevailing theory that we heard over and over again was that COVID developed naturally in animals before making the jump to humans through a Chinese wet market. We all remember that. Well, that was a lie, and Fauci knew it. So on February 1st, 2020, his diary records a meeting with a dozen prominent virologists in which only 2 were willing to credit the natural origins theory. The rest suspected the virus might have been created artificially, not least because a leading scientist in Wuhan, Shi Zhengli, was known to engage in the sort of gain of function research that could produce such a result. So Cenk, let's just pause for a second. If this is the type of virus that would not develop naturally, why would you want humans to artificially create it? I mean, unless you're looking to create biological weapons.
Yeah, so 2 things in that. One is, I agree with you on the substance of it, meaning that even if it's true that the scientists working on it, or maybe even the government official that ordered it, cared to create a defense against viruses, artificially creating a virus to try to find a defense to it is not a good idea.
No, it doesn't make sense.
Okay,
it doesn't make sense.
So no, I get some of the logic of it, but it is taking extraordinary risk, and it's creating risk that you didn't have before to maybe deal with a risk you might or might not have later. So if I just look at it from a logical basis, I would not take that kind of risk, even if you meant well, okay? So that is a very controversial thing to do, and we never discuss it, we never have a debate about it.
Right.
The government just orders it and says, yeah, go ahead, take that wild risk. And that wild risk costs the economy an enormous amount.
So many people died.
And not just at the economy, but my God, across the world, millions of people died because of that risk. So that is not a small thing, it's a giant thing. Number two, that the quote that Anna read you is the one I'm referring to. The scientists actually say, no, we don't think that it was natural, we think it was man-made. And Fauci goes, shut up, scientists.
Yeah.
I am the chief scientist. Jake Tapper, Dana Bash, have me on, which by the way is, well, I'll talk about later. He was huge buddies with the media, and they have him on and they pretend he's speaking for all the scientists.
I know, I totally
When in reality, he squashed what the scientists said and said the opposite.
Yes.
And took two, and only two out of dozens of scientists who said, yeah, I guess it could have been,
a wet market.
Naturally, that it came about naturally. And guys, it was right next to the Wuhan virus lab. What kind of schmuck thinks, oh yeah, it naturally came about right next to the Wuhan virus lab. In fact, that's the first thing that we broke on. Who says we were covering it, we're like, wait. This one doesn't make sense.
So, okay, look, question everything, okay? Question literally everything, because get a load of this. So only 2 of the scientists were willing to entertain the theory that it was a naturally occurring virus, naturally developed virus that jumped from animal to human, okay? Fauci's pushing the wet market theory aggressively, openly, and in public. What was he writing about privately? I take you to his journal entry, January 26, 2020. January 26, 2020, that early on in the pandemic. The diary suggests that by January 26, 2020, Dr. Fauci believed the virus had not originated in the Wuhan wet market, often identified as the source by natural origin advocates. This didn't stop him and allies from painting skeptics of the natural origin theory as politicized cranks and conspiracy theorists.
So 2 things about that. Number one, I'm so done with the phrase conspiracy theory. I looked back to see when it became popularized, and it became popularized right after the JFK assassination, that anyone who questioned the official government story would be called crazy by insinuating they were conspiracy theorists.
I give every conspiracy theorist a listen. I listen. I mean, it doesn't mean I'm gonna believe everything they say, but I'm not gonna just automatically dismiss them anymore.
No,
Sorry.
because we have an entire government, an entire media infrastructure that is now saying that if you ever question the government, you're a conspiracy theorist and a wacko. Okay, so then that's it. I'm done with that line of thinking. And look at Fauci abusing it. And look, if we're on Fauci's side, as we were, okay, I want you to think about it this way. Millions of people died in that virus. Imagine that it wasn't a guy that we were told was on our side. It was a Trump appointment, right? Some lackey that he picked that was in the same position as Fauci. And then a virus breaks out of the lab through incompetence, kills millions of people. And that same guy then buries the news, even though he knows that it came out of that virus. You would say, wait, why did he bury the news? Why wasn't he honest about this? What was it that he did and our government did that he wanted to cover up by pretending that it didn't come from that virology lab, right? You would be very, very skeptical about a Trump appointee who caused these millions of deaths or covered up the real cause of these millions of deaths. You'd be like, why? Why did he do that? And if you're not on Trump's side and you're on the other side, or whichever side you're on, you should always question, why did they do that?
Be on the side of truth. I think the biggest mistake I made personally, so I'll take responsibility for it. When you're so partisan brained and you've convinced yourself that, one side is always wrong and one side is always right, you're gonna make mistakes because either side is never 100% right or 100% wrong. So honestly, and look, part of the problem was also the fact that when the virus broke out, the president of the United States was Trump, and the way that he was communicating about the virus did not inspire much confidence. You get what I'm saying?
Of course.
So it was a crazy time. Everyone's panicking. No one knows what's going on. But let me get to more of what Fauci wrote about in his journal. So he loved to go after his critics, and in fact, in his journal, almost boasted about how aggressively he'd go after his critics. On July 14th, 2020, he tried to squash a skeptical memo about his policies by journal contributor Stephen Moore. I told White House aide Alyssa Farah that the White House, either Meadows or the President of the United States, need to shut up Stephen Moore and stop his publication of Dr. Wrong paper. If he does not, the entire academic community will dump all over the President of the United States.
See, that's a threat. And so why does he have the power to speak for the entire scientific community? I'll say the mistake that I made was not about partisanship, but it was thinking that Fauci spoke for all the scientists and the doctors, right?
Yep.
Because I love scientists and doctors. If they agree to something collectively, it doesn't mean that they're going to be right 100% of the time, but they are far more likely to be right than Bob on Facebook, okay? But I should have been more skeptical that this government official is somehow the avatar for all the scientists and the doctors in the world when he has his own interests, including the interest of covering up some of the things he did and ordered inside the government.
Yes.
And then so now you see that he was lying when he was saying that he was speaking in favor of the scientists, and that's got me enraged.
Yeah, he's actually at war with the scientists internally, behind the scenes. And then the ego, the self-aggrandizement, so embarrassingly, Fauci said of himself, about himself in May of 2020, the situation with my national and international fame is explosive and really unimaginable. Who talks about themselves this way? He continues, it is not hyperbole to say that today I am the most famous and talked about person in the country and one of the most recognizable people in the world.
Well, congratulations. I mean, that's because of a pandemic where millions of people are dying. And this guy's like, but look at how famous I am. Bro, that's not the main lesson, that's the takeaway here.
It gets worse, believe it or not, it gets worse. So he even attempted to distance himself from the infamous lockdown policies, saying that he had no input on local policy at all. So during a meeting in 2024 with members of the House Oversight Subcommittee, that's what he said, right? He tried to distance himself. But in private, well, he told a completely different story. On March 15th, 2020, he wrote that then New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio decided to close city schools based on a conversation they had and Fauci's public remarks. Quote, I went on to tell him he should close the bars and restaurants in New York City. He said that he would base this on my recommendation. Okay, and by the way, if you're wondering about the efficacy of the lockdowns, that has been called into question. I mean, it's just we were lied about everything. We were lied to about everything. A 2024 study published in Scientific Reports found that the pandemic and subsequent lockdowns resulted in worsened development of social cognition skills in early childhood, particularly for students of lower socioeconomic status. Cenk, I remember way later into the pandemic, you and I had a conversation about this, not on air. We were just having a casual conversation about it, and you were really harping on this issue. And we are still suffering the consequences of that. We are still suffering the consequences of the lockdowns, the mental health problems that have arose as a result of the lockdowns. Businesses were destroyed, people's lives were destroyed. I am so furious, and I am happy that Rand Paul didn't let this go. I'm happy that the diary was released. I'm happy that we now know the truth. The real question now, though, is what are we gonna do about it? Not just in relation to Fauci and his conduct, but when it comes to funding and supporting gain of function research in countries like freaking China?
Yeah, that is so weird. Why are we working with them on gain of function research? Okay, so on Rand Paul, I thought he was being unfair in the beginning, but in the midst of some of the hearings, when he started talking about the gain of function research, I was like, wait, that's an interesting point, right? Because as I explained earlier, that's a very dangerous road to go down, even if you're being earnest, right? Yep. So now on the lockdowns, look, I'm still torn on it, because if you have a pandemic and it spreads like wildfire, if it does, and this one did in a lot of ways, right? Not as bad as we thought, but certainly plenty bad enough that it killed about 1 million people inside America. So then you're in a conundrum, but you need to balance that, because the balance is, yes, but the lockdowns also cause massive health problems for Americans, mental health issues, actual like physical health issues,
domestic violence issues,
right? And we're, as human beings, we're not meant to be isolated. That's not the kind of animal that we are. And in fact, that's a huge part of the reason why crime spiked between 2019 and 2022. So 2023. And so that wasn't the only reason, but that was a big part of the reason. So you got to weigh those options, but we didn't weigh them. Instead, we had, shut up. Okay, we're doing this. For example, the kids, that we were torn on that, because the danger was not to the kids as much as the teachers, right? So I was worried about the teachers. On the other hand, we were clear. We said, no, the kids going to school is not much of a problem at all. It barely affects the kids, right? So you've got to be honest about it, and then you've got a balance of interests. You can't just go, I'm gonna go to one side or I'm gonna go on the other side. These are difficult issues, but that's if you care about the general public and American citizens. If you care about yourself and being the most famous person on earth, or writing a book, or or protecting yourself from people finding out about what you authorized earlier, then you're not gonna make the best decisions and have the best balancing act. You're gonna be skewed in that direction. And then finally I get to his relationship with the media. So in his diary, he talks about how much Jake Tapper and him coordinated and he went to their house for dinner, they came to his house for dinner, and Dana Bash and Chuck Todd and Andrea Mitchell. And the coordination, and you remember that threat we just talked about, where he was like, if Trump does this, I'm gonna have the entire scientific community, whether they really mean it or he just speaks for them, right? Through the media, bash Trump. And then the media is like, well, yes, tell us what you need us to do to effectuate this. Wait, now look, if some people say that they're lean in a certain direction, at least that's honest, no problem. Here, I'll give you an example. I really like Ro Khanna. And I've had my disagreements with him, but I'm super upfront with you guys. I think he's one of the best politicians we have. So I don't hide that from you, right? But it's a different thing when Jake Tapper, et cetera, tell us that they're objective. And they don't tell us that they're actually having friendly dinners and correspondence and coordinating messaging with someone they're having on the air, and pretending that, oh golly gee, this is just a guy who happened to come on my show and I happen to push out his agenda, but I'm gonna leave out that we coordinated earlier, right? Yeah. So no, that's a different problem. And when I see anyone using the media to intimidate and bully the rest of us into compliance, that is a giant red flag. So I think that there's a lot more to investigate here in terms of what Fauci's role was. And what I really wanna know is, what did we authorize in that gain of function research?
Seriously.
And why did we authorize it? Who authorized it? Because I think that's the real problem.
100%.
Every time you ring the bell below, an angel gets his wings. Totally not true, but it does keep you updated on our live shows.